Hello and welcome back. Now I'd like to talk to you about some of the intellectual trends that were occurring in Athens during its golden age, namely philosophy, history, and theater. When we talk about philosophy in Athens, the first person we should probably think about is this guy right here, Socrates. He lived from about 470 to 399 BCE in Athens. Let's talk a bit about his life. He was born in Athens to Phainarete and Sophroniscus. His mother was a midwife, and his father was a stone carver. He distinguished himself for his bravery and service to the Athenian army during the Peloponnesian War. So if you're thinking this guy is some guy sitting around stroking his beard, thinking only intellectual thoughts, but is not a man of action, you're wrong. He was actually pretty darn tough. He was apparently able to withstand cold, discomfort, and hunger in his firm resolve and ability to focus on a task at hand. Here are some of his personal traits. He went barefoot. He seldom bathed. He was well known for his bulging eyes, his snub nose, his thick lips, and his gut. He wore a thin cloak, no matter what the weather was like. He was very frugal, spending as little as possible. And yet, he was married twice and had 3 sons. Many people idolized him during his lifetime, such as Plato, who we'll talk about in a minute. However, he was tried and executed in 399 BC for charges of corrupting the young men of Athens and atheism. Well, at the core of his beliefs are a few things. One, knowledge is important for virtue. Virtue is important for happiness. The use of questioning based on arguing from parallel cases is important for possessing knowledge and virtue. So you've got to talk it out and think about things. Self-mastery, self-sufficiency, and moral toughness are important for happiness as well. Desire and friendship have important roles to play in philosophy. And finally, traditional teachers of virtue and wisdom, such as poets and politicians, are usually lacking in both. And here's how Socrates did what he did. He had a way of questioning people or refuting people called elenchus, which means examination or refutation. And in this type of questioning, Socrates would ask a person he's talking to give a definition of a given virtue. The person being questioned provides the answer he thinks is best, and Socrates then shows how the definition is in conflict with some other belief this person has. Finally, this process goes on in theory until the ideal definition of said virtue is reached, which is in harmony with the core beliefs of this person. That's elenchus. And Socrates uses this in an often dizzying kind of way in many of his dialogues. But it turns out we don't actually know anything we know from Socrates. Socrates never wrote down his own philosophy. Instead, we have to rely on this guy to tell us about Socrates. Plato, the founder of the Academy of Athens, was a student of Socrates and wrote down a lot of what we know about the thoughts of Socrates, the man. The death of Socrates, however, affected him profoundly, and his writing began to turn away from the ethics that Socrates was so concerned with and more towards politics. In his Republic, he would order the state in 3 tiers. Philosophers would be kings, there would be guardians or soldiers beneath them, and finally there would be thetes who would do all the work. And he ordered it this way because he believed that the philosophers were the best equipped to rule. Surprise, surprise. He later went on to live in Syracuse, Sicily, and became an advisor to the tyrants Dionysius I and II. He tried to convince them to adopt the scheme of governments laid out in his Republic. Somehow they were declined, though. After a brief stint in prison, he came back to Athens, and at this point he concluded that the Republic was totally wrong, and that he needed to work on the law aspect more, so he wrote a work called the Nomoi, or the Laws. Plato is not the only person who gives us a picture of what Socrates was like. There's also a comic playwright called Aristophanes, and he wrote in a genre called old comedy. And it's the kind of comedy that's current during this period, during Athenian history. And it was topical, so you could talk about the politics that were going on at the time. It was nonsensical, kind of like an episode of South Park. Witty, and quite often vulgar, like an episode of South Park. So when you're thinking about how dirty this might be, well, I would give old comedy typically a solid R rating. So think of the dirtiest movie you can think of on the screen right now that's a comedy. This will be up there with that, if not worse. And the main rule of old comedy is this. Main characters of these plays are kind of everymen, and they're not necessarily smart or clever or rich in a way that allows them to deal with life effectively. right? They often have a tough time doing things that they need to be doing. And his plays have this kind of like air of a Dionysian. That is to say, they allow members of society to express their ideas. They're kind of like transgressive, or not the best of us. The language and behavior of his plays blast social boundaries. He's always saying really dirty things. And the thing is, despite the fact that his plays are so dirty, Aristophanes is actually fairly conservative, and in some ways seems to be saying in some of his plays that Socrates is leading the young men of Athens astray with his alleged rejection of the old gods and teaching them to question old standard definitions of virtue and morality. Did Aristophanes have some kind of beef with Socrates? We don't really know. What we do know is that Socrates himself, in Plato's work The Apology, seems to believe that he was put on trial twice, once by the courts of Athens and another time in a play called The Clouds, which was written by Aristophanes. Socrates actually believed that the play The Clouds, written by Aristophanes, actually was the thing that convinced the people of Athens that Socrates was up to no good and he had to be brought to trial for this. Now let's talk a little bit about history. I want to talk about Thucydides a bit. Thucydides is an historian who lived from 460 to 400 BCE, and he was actually a commander in the Athenian navy who was, for a time, sent into exile, so may have an axe to grind with the Athenians. Nevertheless, he's often thought of as the father of scientific history. So if Herodotus, who's only writing a generation or so before this, is the father of history, Thucydides is the father of scientific history, meaning he updates the research techniques to reflect stricter standards for gathering evidence. So in his writing, there's no mention of a divine intervention. There's a greater emphasis on a cause and effect relationships that's based on logic. His writings on the Peloponnesian War is a reflection of the intellectual trends of the day. He intends his version of events as a guidebook for future generations, as it tells us of the effects of the war on human societies. And his writings on the Peloponnesian War can be thought of in a couple of different ways. One interpretation is that they're kind of like a Hippocratic case study, like he's performing medicine. Who is the patient? Athens. What is the illness? War. That's one way of thinking about it. Another way is thinking of his interpretation of the Peloponnesian Wars as tragedy. And I like this reading. So who's the hero of this tragedy? Athens, of course. And the demos, who had chosen Creon and Alcibiades. That is, the people had chosen these leaders who led them down a bad path. Our hero tries to do something right and screws it up. Hamartia, right? There's a disaster. There's a peripeteia. The invasion of Sicily is our peripeteia. The plague of Athens is a peripeteia. A prophet tells the people of Athens what to do, but they don't listen. There's always a prophet in a Greek tragedy, right? Much of this is the same kind of stuff is going on in Sophocles and Euripides. Thucydides looks at the work of these tragic playwrights and sees a good way of reading the events of his own time in a way that's meant to teach us how to be in the future. Stay tuned for my next lecture on Greek mystery cults and Dionysus.